Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you all this morning?
Wonderful.
Can't hear you very well.
I get really close.
There you go.
You can hold it.
I know I can hold it, but I don't want to hold. I'm moving around with the papers and stuff. Okay, let's see if that works. Does that work?
Yeah.
John, does that work? John's not here.
No, he is. He just couldn't hear you.
I don't know what the people that don't hear and would like to hear more maybe should sit closer to the front so that
The front row's already taken.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I know, for the moment it is, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a question of the voice going directly into the mic also helps. They're good for rock singers.
They are. That's exactly,
I noticed they
exactly
stick
what
them
they're
in the
designed.
mouth. Friends, I'm so pleased to be here. Really. Such a nice, mature crowd. With Baha'i experience. Well, okay, I'm in the crowd too. But I mean not just age, but Baha'i experience. So that consultation and discussions have reference to the writings directly. This is such a boom. It's terrific. We're supposed to be doing this. You know, in the Ruhi books, a number of places, it says that the believers individually should have a program of study of the sacred text. But somehow they're so busy with the activities that they don't make a plan. This is the part that I've been stressing in traveling around, is the role of the individual in participation in the faith. It's fundamental. Without the wholehearted dedication of the individual to the cause, 24 hours a day, it's not going to go anywhere. And this is so important that we realize that we're faced with the whole, this barrier of materialism everywhere, influencing the minds and outlook of people. That our own dedication has to be very intense in order to break through that and to become this hollow reed that we're hearing about this morning and we know about for a long time. We want to get the pith of self out of our being and become channels. And if we do that, then Baha'u'llah sends waiting souls to us. And we don't have to go much further afield. We'll be busy with that. In the last years, since about the year 2000, the House has stressed several times, emphasized the importance of studying the advent of divine justice and some of the world order letters. Now, lately it just said world order letters, so that's a big task, but the ones that they had mentioned earlier, the House mentioned earlier, were the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, the goal of a new world order, and what's the last one on civilization, the last of the world order letters. Those three are particularly important, maybe to start with. And if you haven't read a lot of the Baha'i teachings, Goal of a New World Order is a terrific place to start. And then the Dispensation, which clarifies the position, the station and position of the central figures of the faith and the origins and features of the administrative order, which Shoghi Effendi used to ask the pilgrims, who heads the faith after the passing of the master? And of course they'd say the Guardian. He'd say, no. Have you been reading my letters? In his letters he said that the successor to Abdu'l-Baha was the administrative order. And it had two great pillars, and these two pillars interact, and that was the Guardianship and the Universal House of Justice. All of these features need to be thought about, studied, perhaps take notes while you're studying. I can tell you, back when I became a Baha'i, I think I mentioned it yesterday, you had to study the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah before you could write your essay, why I believe in Baha'u'llah, that then the local assembly would grade. I wasn't a very good writer. I was sure I'd be thrown out on the grounds that my essay wasn't properly punctuated or something. I wasn't quite sure how that was going to turn out. Just a side side story, that night was March, it was a bit cold. We met in a house. The local assembly had been called to meet to consider whether I could become a Baha'i or not. And some of the members weren't very happy about it. They said, well, I had a dinner party, but what? I was sitting alone. The first member arrived in the house and said, what is this all about anyway? This is a damn nuisance. That was a start. And then the rest of the members came, and they were all a bit also agitated. And so they met me and asked a few questions. And then they said, the house is very small and the consultation is confidential. So would you mind standing in the street, please? So it was, California has got a fairly big lawn, and so I'm out in the street there, and 10 minutes passed, 20 minutes passed, 30 minutes passed, 40 minutes passed. I said, it must be a split. Something here, I don't know what's going on, but I didn't feel very good about it. I could have walked home at that point, but I said, no, I got to stick it out. And then finally they called me back in. And the chairman apologized and said, I'm sorry, it took so long. The assembly hasn't met in 8 months and they had a little business they wanted to do, so they could say the closing prayer with you. Well, it might have been nice if I knew that earlier. But anyway, I was glad they finally had accepted that I could become a Baha'i. And we went forward from there. So, the emphasis of the House of Justice on these 3 documents, I think, perfectly legitimizes having regular study classes about them, and certainly that's been the case. Some people say, no, we're not supposed to have study classes, but only do Ruhi. As a group, these are ideas that circulate, and you can't always find the affirmation in a message of the House of Justice about some of the things that friends say to each other. Always good. We get the challenging letters back to the House of Justice saying, did you say no firesides? And the House of Justice will write back and say, can you find that any place in our messages? Nowhere. But then the other ones would find a line in one of the messages of the House of Justice said it wants you to concentrate on the elements of the plan to the exclusion of everything else. Okay, so they said that means no firesides. That was the interpretation. And gradually, over the years, because we haven't had firesides, except occasionally, individuals teaching people, of course, has gone on. Old-timers, which were legal. The other ones that haven't had the experience of giving a general introduction about the faith. And the whole question of the study of the writings, as emphasized by Shoghi Effendi that I was talking about yesterday, about reading, rereading, digesting, and mastering it. All of this fits into the letter that was read to us this morning, which says that the Baha'is give an introduction and a general overview of the faith, and then the Holy Spirit brings confirmation. But this general overview of the faith is a prerequisite for effective teaching. Doesn't mean it can't happen without it, because sometimes the simplest comments that we make leads to a confirmation of a person, and we can always guide friends to other places to hear about the faith, to some other person that's more informed, if we don't feel ourselves informed. Essential, when I was a new Baha'i, they always said, be careful you don't answer questions that you don't know the answer to. You say, okay, God, here I go. And you give an answer, but it puts the people off. It becomes an obstacle. If you don't know the correct answer, say, I'll find out. We have so much, we have everything in the teachings, but we're not professionals, and so we have to go find out. We'll go find out, and we'll share it with you afterwards. The statements of Baha'u'llah, that are one of them that the Guardian has placed in the gleanings, he said it's the first duty of every believer to proclaim the cause of God. Okay, so what is that? Proclaim seems like such a big word. Sounds like more than teaching, but in that passage, the next thing he says, if someone shows interest and response, then teach them. So what is proclamation different from teaching? And I think we find in the letters of the Guardian, for example, he says, on the occasion when you're going to meet someone just briefly, mention the name of Baha'u'llah and the existence of the Baha'i faith. Now, that somehow results difficult for people. The Baha'is feel embarrassed, they don't know how to do it. Once we study the writings enough, and we've got the picture of the cause, and we're solid in the cause, it's easy to talk about. And certainly one can find ways that are not aggressive to present this image, In essence, I would say, and it'd probably be different for each of us, but one of the things that you could say is that, I'm a Baha'i, a follower of the faith of Baha'u'llah. And this is quite an interesting religion. If you haven't heard of it, it's probably a good idea to inform yourself because it's spreading all over the world. And it's called the Baha'i faith. And it offers solutions to all the challenges of modern life and all the things we want to fix. Full stop. The guy gets off the bus or gets onto the subway or whatever it is. You've mentioned the name. Then Shoghi Effendi goes on to say something quite startling. He says, the name Baha'i and Baha'u'llah will go into the subconscious of the person. That's the only place, one of two places that I've seen him use the word subconscious. It goes in there and it cooks, it stays there, it gestates. And he said it can lead to change in behavior. And then in subsequent moments when they hear the name, it strengthens it. I know a woman in the South, the name of Worthington, quite interesting. She's written a few books that are published now on the faith. And she said it usually takes people in our area 3 times to hear about the faith before they kind of say, I better find out about this, First time they hear about it from you and they think, okay, that's a bit odd. What's that? Next time they hear that cousin Jennifer is a Baha'i. What? And then they read in the newspaper that the Baha'is are being mowed down in Iran or something, and that just says, maybe they go looking on the internet. It's wonderful now that people can look on the internet. Before to offer them a book and everything was a bit heavy for people. I don't want to take your book and how can I force my book on? But when you have Baha'i.org and you can go and you can find it all there. I have a business card as a painter, abstract painter, and I stamp on the back of some of the cards. I've got 2 kinds in my wallet. Baha'i.org. So if I haven't gotten very far with the message of the faith, but usually we've talked about your career comes up and talk about art and so on. So I say, inform yourself about this. This is quite interesting. I think you'll be interested. I just leave it at that. They can go themselves in the quiet of their homes and they don't have to be embarrassed and they don't have to compromise their own Catholicism to read it because so many people have that problem. So after you've said this, now the people sometimes respond, they say, oh, I'm so glad you found something you like. Okay, that's one response. The other response is, that's fascinating. How can I find out more about it? Because you get both reactions. But the importance is to be alert to doing that over and over. And I remember a new Baha'i, when I was a new Baha'i, they told me, if you're going to meet a person once, deliver the message. If you're going to meet them more than once, Abdu'l-Baha said, live the life. You moved into an apartment house or somebody's just moved in down the hall and you meet them in the hall and you say, have you heard of Baha'u'llah? I mean, this crazy neighbor I've got here. But you treat them with kindness and shower loving kindness on them and welcome and so on. Opportunities will arise when they will know something about you and they'll hear you're a Baha'i and they'll get interested. But this one-time encounter is something we have to train ourselves in because it's hard to do something. There's a guy next to you on the plane, the lady in the restaurant sitting alone and just talk to, whatever it happens. There's so many circumstances in our life, the lady that's loading things into the laundromat and stands around afterwards and just figure out how to casually mention that such a thing exists and it may be of interest to you. That's all. I hear people saying now, be careful in the first elevated conversation that you don't mention the name of Baha'u'llah. Nonsense. Nonsense, friends. Okay, maybe you can't, but you should. figure it out. It's a question. If we're embarrassed about it, how interested are our listeners going to be? But if we're solid in it and it's presented not in a proselytizing way that you should accept this, but you should know about it, you should be informed about it, see if it's interesting. Some of the Baha'i books, the new books by Fanan al-Pazir that explain the background, I've heard him give firesides. Lame Fanan al-Pazir. He's written one about Islam at the crossroads and another one now about Christianity at the crossroads. And he goes back and he examines progressive revelation, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, on the points that are being raised in the book. And it's so convincing that this is all the same. What are we talking about here? This is identical. The teachings are all identical. But he doesn't do it in an aggressive way. He's not trying to convince you. He's simply saying, have you examined this? Have you looked at this? Have you compared this? Look at this with this. And it just unfolds. I remember a doctor who had heard the presentation of Lame one time, and he said, he doesn't leave you any choice. You either accept it or you reject it. You can't say, oh, I'm glad you like this or something. It doesn't work. It's too challenging, essentially, to your own faith and to your own existence. And that's a very important way to move forward. In the advent of divine justice, towards the end of the advent of divine justice, Shoghi Effendi has selected different passages from the writings on a series of themes, which you're probably well aware of, but I wanted to remind us all about those. This section of the Advent begins, dearly beloved friends, I can do no better, eager as I am to extend to every one of you any assistance in my power that may enable you to discharge more effectively your divinely appointed, continually multiplying duties, than to direct your special attention to this, at this decisive hour, to these immortal passages, gleaned in part from the great mass of Baha'u'llah's unpublished and untranslated writings. Then he outlines the subject matter. When you get into the quotations, you realize this is actually a table of contents, but it's in a sentence. He says, whether in his revelation of the station and functions of his loved ones, or his eulogies of the greatness of his cause, or his emphasis on the paramount importance of teaching, or the dangers which he foreshadows, the counsels he imparts, the warnings he utters, the vistas he discloses, and the assurances and promises he gives. These dynamic and typical example of Baha'u'llah's sublime utterance, each having a direct bearing on the tasks which actually face or lie ahead of the American Baha'i community, very timely, all of it, cannot fail to produce on the minds and hearts of any one of its members who approaches them with befitting humility and detachment such powerful reactions as to illuminate his entire being and intensify tremendously his daily exertions. Who doesn't want that? It's on the face of the Kindle. I don't have a page number. Anybody hands me a copy of the Advent, I can turn to it and give you the page.
I do with me, but I thought maybe it gave it.
No, I'm sorry, it doesn't have it here. And I like the new edition. You've got paragraph numbering too, which is very helpful.
I'll bring my Advent and see if you can.
Okay, well, let's have to. So just to quote a few of these encouragements. He says, "Oh friends," first quotation. And if you go and take that and you make a list of those subjects, you can see how the whole ththing breaks down. I had a little booklet. I don't know. They may publish. The NSA may publish it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
The NSA may publish it. Publishing trust called Immortal Passages, because he defines these as immortal passages. And then you break them down by the sections that he's outlined there, and it becomes quite an interesting little book to carry with your prayer book. because he says this has a bearing on your daily exertions, you want to be able to have reference to it. So this is on page 113 of this new edition, and it's paragraph 108, where the whole section begins. And it goes on for quite some pages. Goes on to page 129. O friends, be not careless of the virtues with which ye have been endowed, neither be neglectful of your high destiny. Ye are the stars of the heaven of understanding, the breeze that stirreth at the break of day, the soft-flowing waters upon which must depend the very life of all men, the letters inscribed upon his sacred scroll. Did you know that's what you were? O people of Baha, ye are the breezes of spring that are wafted over the world. Through you we have adorned the world of being with the ornament of the knowledge of the Most Merciful. Through you the countenance of the world hath been wreathed in smiles, and the brightness of his light shone forth. Cling ye to the cord of steadfastness in such wise that all vain imaginings may utterly vanish. Speed ye forth from the horizon of power in the name of your Lord the Unconstrained, and announce unto his servants, with wisdom and eloquence, the tidings of this cause, whose splendor hath been shed upon the world of being. Beware, lest anything withhold you from observing the things prescribed unto you by the pen of glory, as it moveth over his tablet, with sovereign majesty and might. Great is the blessedness of him that hath hearkened to its shrill voice, as it was read, with the power of truth, before all who are in heaven and all who are on earth. It just keeps pouring out like that. About the teaching word, let's see if we get what that is. The first part of another section, he says, Verily I say, no one hath apprehended the root of this cause. It is incumbent upon everyone in this day to perceive with the eye of God and to hearken with his ear. Whoso beholdeth me with an eye besides mine own will never be able to know me. None among the manifestations of old, except to a prescribed degree, hath ever completely apprehended the nature of this revelation. Hard for us to imagine why we popped out into existence at this particular blessed moment in the whole history, recorded history of mankind. It's the best time of ever. And you say, well, I wish I'd been born in the time of Baha'u'llah and I could have seen him and known him. Yes, that is a very blessed period, but that's past. But we have this gorgeous passage from Shoghi Effendi in God Passes By, where he, after the passing of Baha'u'llah, he says, how the manifestation, now freed from the constraints of a physical being, is able to shine with ever greater glory upon the community, upon the friends. There's something added after his passing. We haven't just lost out. It's there, and it gets brighter and brighter, and he tells us that this progressive revelation not only applies to successive dispensations of his guidance, but in the revelation itself, there is the passing of the Son of Truth to the apex of creation. One is the image in his own ministry, where the faith is born in the Seychal, and then at mid-morning he's revealed the Kitabi Gone and the books of Baghdad, and he reaches high noon and he has the proclamation to the kings and rulers, and the mid-afternoon the laws and the principles that govern the whole dispensation, and finally the sun sets with the passing of Baha'u'llah. Over and over this image is drawn by the guardian. But he also says that we're at the beginning of the dispensation, and the power of the Son of Truth is like still the early morning. We're the early birds, so to speak. And we're rising with this, and the power of the cause that's instilled into creation, not coming from us, coming from him, already inherent. Abdu'l-Baha says the kingdom of God is already established in the heavenly realms and will appear by degrees in this world. We're part of appearance of the degrees. By our efforts, we also release the potentialities of that, both within our own being and in those that we're able to share the faith with. The section in here on what the teacher should do is a very helpful one. The greatness of this day is also something to be rehearsed and thought about. You wonder what is it that got you into the cause? I mean, so many people. Abdu'l-Baha said there's no excuse for anyone after his trip across America. He said he proclaimed the faith. At least 90,000 people witnessed him personally talking about the cause. Imagine. And then how many more? He said my talks were syndicated. They published in national newspapers. There really wasn't any excuse for people not knowing about it. And yet Shoghi Effendi mentioned that his mission was a failure.
Oh.
And the pilgrims started when he said that. He said not Abdu'l-Baha's failure, the failure of the American people to adequately respond to this immense magic, this terrific mystery of God moving amongst them and pure spirit flowing out of him, describing the faith in all of its aspects. And they were deeply moved. People talk about it, but somehow, they went out of the meeting and they said, I feel like an ice cream. Would go and do something else, and then it was gone, But how do you, others were transformed, yes, but not so many of them as needed to be. There's the whole role of the master in the West, as I was mentioning yesterday, with several letters to the Guardian affirming that. We need to master the method of Abdu'l-Baha speaking in the West. Because the same problems that people come up with were the ones that were in their minds when he was here. The same materialism had prevailed. He talked about civilization having two aspects to it, having the spiritual aspect and the material aspect. He said the material aspect is going along just fine. doesn't need your help. He said concentrate your attention on the spiritual aspect, the divine aspect. He said because that will help control the limits of the material civilization. Material civilization gets out of hand with its armaments and its avarice and ambition to rule others and so on. But the spiritual one checks that and brings it back into a proper equilibrium. It's very, very important. I think, friends, we're told we need to think deeply about it. We're told that prayer and meditation without action is self-indulgence. People have been saying this lately, like if you're not using it to serve others, then what's the point? And to a certain degree that's true, except that we have to remember that the action of praying, the action of meditating, is an action that's meritorious in itself. It has meaning in itself. It's not just self-indulgence. It's self-transformation. It's preparing ourselves so that we can pass that illumination and charge on to others. And the greatest of all acts is the repetition of my name amongst mankind. It's not cleaning the park and sweeping streets and helping children after school. Those are fine, wonderful acts, but those are not the principal ones. And we shouldn't deny these things that are so clear in our teachings about that we're the only ones that can convey the message to mankind. And that's the greatest service in the sight of God that we can do. So without, getting into arguments or contradicting some of these other opinions, and we can help with the park too, it's fine. But let's not forget that the key things that are in our writings about this. And this is why the House of Justice is referred to in the rooming courses as encouraging us to have an individual program of study of the writings and absorption of the tablets. Why the gleanings needs to be our constant companion. Why we need to memorize characteristic passages from these writings. So that when the opportunity arises to ground and confirm waiting souls, we're up to the task. And if we aren't, we at least know somebody we can take the friends to. This first proclamation doesn't need a whole lot of, it needs some wisdom how to do it, not offend people, not be too pushy about it. But as just as a matter of information that you ought to know about this. I sometimes chide people on the airplanes as that the name Baha'i comes up, and they said, they look puzzled. I said, you've heard of it, haven't you? They said, no, I have never heard of it. Oh, so it's a surprise to me because it's all over the world, I think it's something you should at least check out, God is pleased with that approach or not. Okay. Satisfies me to say something. So that the advent of divine justice is just full of so many things we need to know and absorb in our vision. And I hope that if you don't have any study class in your area on it, and if you haven't read it recently, that you go back and read carefully and have paper and pencil and note down things that strike you. We're changing all the time. We come to the fountain and sometimes we drink a little and sometimes we drink a lot. But our capacity is always evolving. So this is why you can't do the Agon again, because you're a different person each time you approach it. The river changes every time you go to the riverside. And your own vision of things, like the hidden words, you're never going to run out of inspiration from the hidden words, because every time you approach it, you're a different person. And the reason why one needs to absorb the hidden words, very important. I think prayer book and hidden words like constant companion too. Did I mention yesterday the letter from the Guardian? He said, if you live the life, Baha'u'llah will send waiting souls to you. How are we going to find Shoghi Effendi? Nobody's interested. Yeah, that's right. Nobody's interested because you're not interested. The answer he didn't give back, but basically we need to ask ourselves, are we excited enough about the faith to communicate it with some joy and excitement when we do it? And that depends on our absorbing the teachings from the source, from the writings. Regularity in our obligatory prayers and fasting, fundamental, the two pillars that uphold the spiritual life of man, we're told in the writing. Obligatory prayer and fasting. You remember from the Akdas, when Baha'u'llah introduces the law of fasting, he doesn't say, "O ye Baha'is," or "O my dear followers." He says, "O peoples of the world, we have ordained a fast for you." Tell your neighbors, you're under this obligation to go and fast with us. Come along. This has worked in school. I've done that at times. Somebody say, "Wow, fast, that's so interesting." I said, "No, it's open to you too." The proclamation of God in this day, the law is everybody should be fasting. Unless you're as old as we are, and that's it. He's excused us, but I know Ray Connor kept fasting right on into her 80s. Ray Connor, how do you do it? How do you have the energy? She says, "Well, I get up and I have 2 pork chops first thing in the morning." That wasn't the answer I expected, but so Shoghi Effendi would kind of look my direction, but I didn't say. Anyway, she said Shoghi Effendi was not accustomed to eating breakfast, and he fasted 24 hours. He just wait until supper and fill himself. And in case you thought you were going to die if you missed breakfast sometime. My mother used to always think I was going to die because I didn't eat lunch. She said, "How can you do that?" I don't think once in her life she ever not had lunch. She couldn't imagine what would happen to a person if they didn't have lunch, The synthesis of the writings on the kind of thing we need to understand, which arose from Shoghi Effendi receiving pilgrims in the early 30s, in the 1930s. Keith Ransom Taylor and Laurel Schaufflacher was there. They were talking about how the Baha'is believed that Abdu'l-Baha was the return of Christ. Baha'u'llah is the Father, Abdu'l-Baha is the Son. What could be more clear than that? And Shoghi Effendi said that how many times Abdu'l-Baha had clarified this matter. And they said that when you bring this up with the believers and try to bring this point of view, that the believers say that was Abdu'l-Baha being kind to the people who didn't have enough understanding and wisdom to be able to see that he was the Christ. Shoghi Effendi said, that's blasphemous. You can't do that. You have to follow the teachings the way Abdu'l-Baha explains it. And he said, I'm not, over and over again, I'm not Jesus Christ. I'm not a manifestation of God. And he said that the Baha'is, by doing that, played into the hands of the covenant breakers. Because the covenant breakers said Abdu'l-Baha was not saying he was the manifestation of God, but he was acting like one. Well, blessings on anybody who can act like a manifestation of God. That's already miraculous. I don't think it's something to complain about. But anyway, that was their excuse. Muhammad Ali said, there's nobody. He says, if anybody says they're from God, have a message from God after the manifestation, they're a liar. And that was the basis of the covenant breakers attacking Abdu'l-Baha. And Abdu'l-Baha over and over said, don't say I'm the messenger of God. I'm not the messenger of God. I'm the successor. I'm the moon of the sun of Baha'u'llah. Yes. Is the mystery of God far beyond our understanding of ever to place him anywhere in the right position, never mind how we were defining it. I think that, if our idea that he was the return of Christ was probably much less than the position Abdu'l-Baha actually had, because of how we would understand the manifestation of God. As we see in the Igan, reading the Igan over and over those passages, how the manifestation of God is God, in a sense. He is the face of God for us. Well, when you think about what we were talking about yesterday, the manifestations all over the universe, I suppose there must be an infinite number of Baha'u'llahs appearing to planets at their point of evolution throughout the universe, simultaneously right now. So this is, again, religious truth is relative and not absolute. Baha'u'llah is the Lord of the day of God here on our planet. But this thing goes on in all directions. So in one sense, you can't, if you say Baha'u'llah is God, you have to understand it in the terms that the writings say. Otherwise, it's not correct. We don't believe that God becomes a physical being. But we do believe that the manifestations of God in their inmost spirit are the mirrors of the light of God. And the light of God is not God either. He says there's a divine essence, there's a supreme essence behind that again is inaccessible. But I think it's very comforting, it's a wonderful mercy on the part of God that he sent manifestations to us. When you think of this vast universe and the Lord of the universe that's behind the infinity of creation. And we're going to address him and say, can you just help me out? My knee is sore. Okay, the manifestation of God is close by. You can ask him intimately. And Shoghi Effendi says clearly in letters, you can pray to Baha'u'llah, you can pray through Baha'u'llah. And in these conversations with Keith Ransom Cater, he says, and if you're foolish enough, you can pray to God directly. Why would you do that when you have the channel that he's provided for you to do it? People say, well, I can pray to God. I don't need a manifestation. Yeah, that's right. You could do that. But why would you do that when the channel is right there and it connects you immediately and avoids the problem of these vain imaginings about what God is or who God is or where God is? He says he has a will of his own. The manifestation tells us, and Shoghi Effendi confirms it. We believe in a personal God. He's not a force, a blind force in the universe. He's perfectly awake to every one of us. Now, how do you figure that out, you're busy praying. I'm sorry I have to wait in line because you're praying and I can't get a chance. No, it doesn't work like that. He's immediate to us, not only to us, but to all the beings throughout the universe. How is that? How can you get that in your head, Finally, Abdu'l-Baha explains how we're like just a little blade of grass, that exists in the universe. It's amazing. By the time you read these things enough of them and meditate on them, pretty much you get to realize the sublimity, he says, of maturity is the recognition of your own powerlessness before this. We submit ourselves, we can be used as an instrument. If any of us thinks that we're the cause of change in people or the transformation of people, he says the force of the cause will sweep you aside and it goes forward without you. But why do you see some prominent teachers that become ineffective? He mentions that. So we all have to be thinking in those terms ourselves, How Shoghi Effendi has honed and directed us and clarified matters and organized the writings. God Passes By is a review. He says not a complete history, but a review of the highlights, which resolve themselves into crises and victories, a series of crises and victories. Without the interpretation of Shoghi Effendi as the sign of God, who, as is clear in the writings, knows the mind. Baha'u'llah says, Abdu'l-Baha says, he knows the mind of Baha'u'llah. That's why he can interpret the writings. And the Guardian likewise, at a different level, he says, quite independent of that. He also knows the intention of Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah. He doesn't need tablets to know what it means. He has that immediate connection. And then he gives it to us, gives us that interpretation. He said that future guardians, he himself talks about future, right? He said future guardians may interpret these in a different way, because there's multiple meanings to the writings. But he gives us the meaning that we need at this time for things. This is fascinating. That's why Shoghi Effendi certainly knew he didn't have a successor. And he speaks about future guardians in the last year of his life, in messages, in letters. But it looks like Shoghi Effendi was going to carry this matter, which was not specified in the will, what happens if you don't have a successor, to the House of Justice. But he didn't, this has got to be the will of God, he didn't reach the time when he could present this matter to the House of Justice. And the House of Justice says he was unable to solve this problem of successorship because there was no indication in the will, and he is an interpreter, not a legislator. He couldn't make a new way to make the guardian. That would have been a violation of his role as guardian of the faith. So he would have been required, he said, to bring this to the House of Justice as a matter that's not specified in the teachings. And now the House of Justice has taken the matter up and studied it and says they find no way to appoint a successor to Shoghi Effendi as guardian or to legislate to make possible the appointment of a guardian. Very interesting decision. And then you have the covenant breakers and others saying, oh, but there has to be a guardian. There must be a guardian. You have to look and you'll find Mason Remy, who by that time was deaf and dumb practically, saying that he was the one. But the will and testament says that the guardian has to present his successor to the hands of the cause, and they have to affirm, majority of them, that this is an appointment in order to avoid division after the passing of Abdu'l-Baha. So this is completely closed case. And then we have the very strong evidence in the Kitabi Aqdas, in the most holy book, with regard to Baha'i properties. Question of defining of Baha'i properties, he says that Baha'i properties belong to God. Baha'u'llah didn't say. And after me, because he's God, for this planet and for this time. They go to the chosen Agsam. And after the Aksan, if their time ends before the House of Justice, they go to the Awliya. And in a tablet, he says this word Awliya refers to the hands of the cause. So look, we have the chosen Aksan, Abdu'l-Baha 1, Shoghi Effendi 2, ends. The hands of the cause have been appointed. They have to take on that interim period until the House of Justice is formed, and then the House of Justice takes on the properties and everything else. But it clearly indicates there may be a time when we don't have a guardian. And the House of Justice cites this in 3 major letters that supplement the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. And that's published in Guardianship and the Universal House of Justice. It's a separate booklet, but those well-informed Baha'is can guide you to those. I'm going to put them in the book. I'm writing about the essential verities of the faith, so that they're also available there. And that's the House of Justice answering the concerns and doubts of the friends with regard to why there isn't another guardian. And all these proofs and evidences are summarized there. Dispensation again defines the role of the Baha, that actually the believers had more esteem for Abdu'l-Baha than the Baha because they didn't know about the Baha. And Shoghi Effendi says it's the opposite, that after Baha'u'llah comes the position of the Baha. We have 3 central figures, Baha'u'llah, the Baha, and Abdu'l-Baha. We have twin central figures, Baha'u'llah and the Baha. And we have the central figure, Baha'u'llah. These are references from Shoghi Effendi's own writings, so we've got different ways of looking at that hierarchy. Friends, before I forget, because I was thinking to add that in the earlier discussion of who you are, who we are, in conveying, we become the inheritors of the manifestation of God. He's depending on us, the individuals throughout the world. Shoghi Effendi says, without their action, there's no hope for the guardian even to go forward with the cause. Everything depends on the individual. We have the option here to play the role of successor to the manifestation in the sense of being teachers of the cause, sharing the beauty of it. What a privilege. And actually, it's that privilege and that action which is our destiny and which is the hope for our own soul. And we're only going to be here once, so we better get it right. You know? Seize thy chance, for it will come to thee no more. He's calling for a level of dedication that is not customary in this life and in the community in general. How can we attain that? How can we, in our prayers, beg him to show us how we can do more for the faith? Outside of the schedules of the collective activities of the cause, the individual has responsibility 24 hours a day. So you say, well, I do my teaching during the cycle of growth. Yes, you should be doing that. But the rest of the time, you have your individual responsibilities. So we have individual duties and responsibilities, and we have collective responsibilities. We need to have those in balance. We need to be sure that the collective responsibilities depend on us doing our individual responsibilities, which include then the obligatory prayer and the fasting and preparing our souls and being in submission to the writings and the rules of the cause. If we do that, again, he says we will find the souls. And there's got to be waiting souls. It was what we heard earlier on the Guardians to say 2% of mankind is waiting. 2% doesn't sound like very much, but it's a lot. Think if you're in a city of 10,000, it's got a lot of potential people to find for the cause. And again, if we're thinking in our prayers and asking to be guided to those that need to hear the message, that are ready to hear the message, that are the ones that I think somebody said yesterday, that say, how did it take you so long to tell me this? Why didn't you We're going to meet our neighbors in the next world. They're going to say, you never told me about this. You were living next to me for 10 years and you never told me about the Baha'i teachings. They get to the next world, they realize that was the source of bounty or something. Something for us to think about. Everybody in our environment, surveying those. And sometimes we have to buy time through love and kindness and things and find the moment. Other times we're just on the spot. The dispensation of Baha'u'llah defines all kinds of basic verities about the position of Baha'u'llah, about the position of the manifestation, about our own understanding of God, the teachings that we have. All that's there. It's a book to be read and reread. I remember I was grounded in the dispensation by Jesma Herbert. Jesma Herbert had been the secretary of the National Teaching Committee during the second 7-year plan. And she became one of the first members of the Auxiliary Board for Protection. Terrific lady. What a vision. She said every 6 months read the dispensation. Again, because we change and we see it in a new light. I started to tell you the other day about reading 2 hours a day, and I thought now that I'm retired I can do that. I don't think I finished the joke. So I said I'm going to do that. So the next day I started off to reading, and it takes me about 10 minutes to fall asleep. So while you're younger, like you people, you've got to try to get more of it in before you fall asleep, or maybe you won't fall asleep. That's a constant challenge. There are beautiful things about the dispensation and about Shoghi Effendi's writings in general. Oh, I don't have them in front of me. Let's see if I can find this here. How would you define, in a few words, Baha'u'llah? How would you define in a few words the Bab? How would you define in a few words Abdu'l-Baha? Fortunate for us, Shoghi Effendi several times has taken on that task. Beautiful. Look at what he says here. Dominating the entire range of this fascinating spectacle towers the incomparable figure of Baha'u'llah, transcendent in his majesty, serene, awe-inspiring, unapproachably glorious. How would you define Baha'u'llah in one sentence? And can you better that? I don't think so. And can we learn that? And this is the definition of the feeling in the shrine of Baha'u'llah. These very elements. Again, incomparable, transcendental in his majesty, serene, awe-inspiring, unapproachably glorious. Now imagine having to go on in the next sentence to define the Bab. Are you going to say the same thing again, or is it different, or what's the difference? And this difference is also in the spirit of the shrines. That I found myself anyway in the Holy Land contemplating this. He says now, allied, though subordinate in rank, and invested with the authority of presiding with him over the destinies of this supreme dispensation, there shines upon this mental picture the youthful glory of the Bab. I'll go on with the definition, but let's look back at this. Allied, though subordinate in rank. One of the ways you could say the Son of Truth is this central orb of our religion, of our faith, is Baha'u'llah. And the Bab also is another sun. And it turns out that in the universe there are many of these solar systems that have twin suns, twin stars at the heart. But one is always fixed and is the very center, and the other revolves around that. Now imagine the interesting shadows you get when you have two suns of different colored lights and so on. Pretty exciting. But we've got it in the faith. We have both these. And this is the wonder of this dispensation, that it has two manifestations reigning over its destinies, as repeated by Abdu'l-Baha in the Will and Testament. He says, they're both under the care and protection of the Blessed Beauty and of the Bab, both the House of Justice and the Guardian. Two sources of light that they were receiving. And we are likewise under those two sources of light. So then he goes on to define. Now he talks about the youthful glory of the Bab. He talked about the incomparable figure of Baha'u'llah, the youthful glory of the Bab, infinite in his tenderness, irresistible in his charm, unsurpassed in his heroism, matchless in the dramatic circumstances of his short yet eventful life. There you go, the definition of the Bab. Now we're moving on to the third of the central figures. And finally there emerges, Shoghi Effendi writes, though on a plane of its own, and in a category entirely apart from the one occupied by the twin figures that preceded him, the vibrant, the magnetic personality of Abdu'l-Baha, reflecting to a degree that no man, however exalted his station, can hope to rival the glory and power with which they who are the manifestations of God are alone endowed. Amazing position. How many times have we read that? How many times have we thought about that, meditated about it? Then the Guardian moves on. He says, with Abdu'l-Baha's Ascension, he talks about the greatest holy leaf, and she's the last really figure, the leftover from the apostolic age. And then he begins addressing the whole picture of the dispensation itself. He says, dearly beloved friends, the onrushing forces so miraculously released through the agency of two independent and swiftly successive manifestations are now under our very eyes and through the care of the chosen stewards of a far-flung faith being gradually mustered and disciplined. The forces released are being mustered and disciplined. They're slowly crystallizing into institutions that will come to be regarded as the hallmark and glory of the age we are called upon to establish and by our deeds immortalize. Which age is that? 3 ages in the faith. We have the heroic age, and then what? The formative age. So that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about this period, the formative age that we are in, where those forces released during the heroic age are crystallizing, are gathering, transforming themselves into processes for the accomplishment of the goals of the revelation itself. For upon our present day efforts, and above all, the extent to which we strive to remodel our lives after the pattern of the sublime heroism associated with those gone before us, must depend the efficacy of the instruments we now fashion. Instruments that must erect the structure of that blissful commonwealth which must signalize the golden age of our faith. Eventually, if you're reading Shoghi Effendi, you're going to have to come to grips with epochs, ages, and stages, and dispensations. How are they defined? How do these ages relate to each other? What are the signs of the coming of the golden age? What are the things to be accomplished in the formative age? All this is in the writings of Shoghi Effendi. He used to ask the pilgrims, do the friends read my messages? They'd ask him some question, like I've answered that. And you may read some of the later writings of the Guardian and see some reference to something, and you say, what in the world does that refer to? Go back to the beginning of his writings. You'll find that he doesn't do that. He's defined it earlier on if he makes it a reference to it. It's not as if you're supposed to know it subliminally or something. It doesn't work that way. Gather all these things. His vision of the future, which is something that we are deprived of without the guardianship, is the possibility of seeing into the future. And believe me, I knew that. We knew that as house members. We do what we felt inspired to do at that meeting, and trust that that was the pattern that we needed to go forward with. Because but we do have some vision from Shoghi Effendi where he's described the stages of the future, what will happen and how they need to be accomplished. There will be a time when the House of Justice will raise the banner of the most great peace. As a banner, he said, even, mark mankind's beginning of this. What's the most great peace? He said the lesser peace is the political unification of mankind. The most great peace is the spiritualization of that unification. And that only comes about by the diffusion of the forces and grace of Baha'u'llah through the efforts of the believers everywhere in the world. I've gone over my time. Well, as far as I can tell, you're awake, so look, maybe tomorrow we can have a little supplementary time if there is any during the day for questions and answers. So I promise you are open, and if you do have questions and answers, and if I can refer you to something in the teachings to answer them, I'll be happy to try to do something. Thank you so much.